Hey kids, how you doing? Um, as we continue to learn about the kind of what was going on between the major countries involved in World War II, between the wars, end of World War One to the beginning of World War II, uh, we're going to concentrate today on the countries that pretty much won World War One. You've got Britain, France, and the United States, and we're also going to throw in there uh, the country of Spain, who we really haven't talked about before, at least since we did Lewis and Clark, and we're probably not going to talk too much about again. And I can get into that in just a few minutes, but we'll kind of take a look at those countries. We'll see what was going on with them because while all this other stuff was happening with the rise of fascism and Soviet Russia and all that kind of thing, these countries just kind of were so exhausted by their experience of World War One that they were really just hoping maybe things won't go bad. And unfortunately, they kind of buried their head in the sand because things were going badly. And and by the time they woke up to that idea, uh, it was it was too late uh, for any opportunity to fix it short of war. So that's kind of where we got. But let's take a look at the article, and you can follow along while I read. Okay, World War II, between the wars, Western Europe and the USA, the challenge of the democracies. The nations most responsible for the Versailles Treaty were the Western democracies of France, Britain, and the United States. These countries were the winners of the First World War. However, winning the peace proved to be far more difficult than winning the war. The Wounded Lion. Great Britain seemed to be just as powerful after the war as before. However, the loss of hundreds of thousands of men at the Battle of the Somme, together with the enormous economic strain from fighting the war, began to crack one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. Many of the colonies in the British Empire wished for greater control over their own affairs. Mostly the colonials were content with British rule. Nationalism, though, was a very potent force in the 20th century. Many British colonials read Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points and began to question their relationship with Great Britain. They wondered why countries such as Czechoslovakia and Hungary had a right to self determination, yet they did not. Colonies like India supported the British effort during World War I, expecting greater say over their own affairs after the war in return. To their disappointment, the British government tightened their hold over the colonies during the 1920s. Meanwhile, newer powers such as Japan gained strength and threatened to rival Britain's influence in Asia. And there you see a picture of Mahatma Gandhi, independence leader in the country of India. Uh, it was one of these individuals who, he was pretty much okay with British rule of India, or at least was okay with the idea of a gradual transfer of power. And then when he saw that the British really weren't interested in that sort of thing, he started to push harder. He's an interesting story, and his tactics had a lot to do with what was later on used by the civil rights movement here in the United States. Le Grand Illusion. France was the biggest winner of World War I and also its biggest loser. They committed more troops than any other country and were exhausted by the end of the war. Millions of men were lost fighting Germany from 1914 to 1918, and France vowed never to be invaded by Germany again. France pushed for ever stiffer terms in the Versailles Treaty. This stressed relations with their British ally, who didn't want to see Germany punished too severely. The French were invaded by Germany in both 1871 and in 1914, and would be again in 1940. It is impossible to say the French were foolish to fear the Germans. Unfortunately for France, along with victory in the war came a sense of arrogance among the French military. This led to an inability to change with the times. Since they had won World War I with trench warfare, the French assumed that future wars would be fought in trenches. Meanwhile, Germany lost the war and vowed never to get stuck in the slaughter of the trenches again. The Germans developed new military tactics that emphasized speed and movement, while the French always looked back to what they did from 1914 to 1918. France's biggest military achievement of the 1920s and 1930s was the construction of the Maginot Line. This was a series of forts and bunkers along the German border that would have been the envy of any army in World War I. It was not still 1918, though. The Maginot Line ignored the fact that Germany invaded through Belgium in 1871 and in 1914 and would again in 1940. There were no forts along that border since France and Belgium were friends. The German army that started World War II in 1939 was the most educated, motivated, and technically advanced army the world had ever seen. The army that defended France in 1940 was basically the same one that limped home after the armistice in 1918. And there you see an example of one of those Maginot Line forts that was actually built inside of a mountain. And that's really elaborate. And essentially, these are just giant trenches that were built before the war was even supposed to start. And the thought was, well, if we build them before, they'll be better than anything anyone can possibly do. And pretty much the Germans just went around them, and that was about it. Killing ground in Spain. Spain was a somewhat forgotten nation in the 1920s and 1930s. The Spanish were neutral in World War I and were a fairly stable republic into the 1930s. Government policies then veered sharply towards socialism, and this met with strong resistance in conservative Catholic Spain. In 1936, civil war erupted. The Spanish army, composed mainly of men who considered themselves fascists like those in Italy, fought against the militias of the Republican government. A general named Francisco Franco led the Spanish fascists. From the beginning, the conflict attracted world attention. Volunteers from all over the world went to Spain to fight the fascists. The Spanish Republic was openly aided by the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the fascists received open support from fascist Italy, who sent troops and equipment. Nazi Germany also secretly supplied equipment and tested their newest military techniques on behalf of the fascists. High overhead, the new German Luftwaffe, or Air Force, practiced high altitude bombing for the first time. Pablo Picasso's famous painting Guernica showed his impressions of the Spanish town of Guernica after the Luftwaffe rained fire from the sky. By 1939, the fascist forces captured the capital of Madrid and won the Spanish Civil War. It provided a chilling dress rehearsal for the war brewing in Europe. Isolated from responsibility. The USA was drawn into World War I and tipped the balance in favor of the Allies, becoming the most powerful nation on earth in the process. Sadly, the USA refused to accept this role after the war ended. Americans did not want to become involved in European affairs again and pursued a policy of isolationism, meaning they had little to do with the outside world. The USA never joined the League of Nations, even though it was Woodrow Wilson's idea. Without the USA, the League never had the muscle to force aggressive countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan to stop their behavior. The isolationism of the 1920s and 1930s led the US military to be unprepared for war with Japan. This showed in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941. The USA was in a war for which it was not prepared and would absorb months of humiliating defeats before it could turn the tide and defeat the Axis powers. So, talked about Britain, France, the United States. Also talked about Spain. Spain had a very famous uh, civil war during the years right before World War II, and it's kind of been viewed as almost like a dress rehearsal for World War II. Now, you're not going to hear very much about Spain going forward because actually, after their civil war was over, Spain, even though the fascists won, Spain did not jump in on the side of the fascists and the Nazis. General Franco, who was the leader, decided to stay neutral. He was pretty friendly with the Italians and the Nazis, but he never officially was in charge or never officially entered into World War II. So you're not going to hear too much about Spain from this point forward. But it was definitely a conflict that attracted world attention, for a couple of years there, and then it just sort of disappears. So yeah, this is kind of the last time that you hear much of anything about Spain. All right, so we will be moving on, and we'll actually get to the official start of the war here very soon. Okay, take it easy.